Today, I'm going to delve a little bit into the connection between women, weaving, and particularly war. Um, I am going to start by saying that a lot has been done in archaeology lately to retrieve the social world of women and highlight the major importance of their activities, either regarded as not that interesting so far in research or influenced by prevailing attitudes in popular reception. So there was, for a very long time, an underrepresentation problem with regard to women's activities. So in this presentation, I am going to reflect on the potential cultural and magical interplay between an essentially female and domestic activities such as textile work and some aspects of mythology, particularly a battle which comes into being through weaving, interpreted as a prophecy. From the start, I should say that textiles have been critical to the development of Viking society and of society in general, they pose this problem of the issue of the value of women's work in general. As demonstrated by archaeologist Michelle Hayer-Smith, who has been doing a lot of research into this topic, the style of Viking weaving meant a wood horizontal bar on two vertical ones, holding the separate vertical threads weighted down by volcanic stones, with regard to Iceland, separating the warp threads by holding a heddle rod. One draws the horizontal weft thread in and out of one or more warp threads, and the process took place in a very special place called a dyngja, which was a weaving hut with turf or wood walls and a hearth in one corner for warmth, generally speaking, a tight space where women could form bonds with each other, share knowledge and craftsmanship, a space of feminine energy, usually avoided by men, as we can also see when we read the sagas. There was this taboo going on with regard to men entering this type of room. Even after the coming of Christianization, when looms were brought into the area of the longhouse, weaving would still be performed in a confined space. Taboos were not only linked to gender, but also to the economic significance of this act. Before changes in technology in the 18th century brought about a reorganization of textile production and integration into centralized production overlooked by certain patrons, women had monopoly over an intensive, essential, and very time-consuming activity in the same time. So we are dealing with the transformation of the role of women in society, but for about 800 years, they were pretty much in charge of this very important activity going on, like I said before, in specific rooms, as you can see here in this example from Hedeby or Haithabu in Schleswig in northern Germany. This is also linked to a more general task of women in this time, which was estate management. With regard to the activities, to the concrete activities going on, basically we have spinning and weaving, and the objects that were produced ranged from clothing such as long-sleeved shirts, undertunics, embroidered necklines and cuffs, trousers, jackets of heavy wool, kaftans, if you look further to the east, cloaks, woolen caps, mittens, leggings, puff trousers. Ragnar Lothbrok himself, the famous one, has his nickname from this specific type of trousers. You could also have clothing with the so-called rökkvar technique, which meant attaching fleece to the warp teased out from the surface, which basically created a fake fur effect. But besides clothing, also curtains were produced, bed sheets, pillows, tablecloths, tents, and of course sails, which were essential in this age, because without sails we wouldn't have the Viking Age at all. At the higher end of all this spectrum of activities, we have visual narratives in the form of wall hangings, tapestries, complex ones, which adorned the halls of the great chieftains, pointing out control of the social memory and political history at the time. And researcher Neil Price designates this with the term collective cultural statement, such as this example here from the Oseberg tapestry, retrieved from the 9th century. Unfortunately, retrieving such objects is very tricky. Most of them are in pretty bad shape. Nevertheless, we do have some tools. On the other hand, we also have references in the sagas, and more recent, we also have experimental archaeology. The many daily uses in the Viking Age included products with many variations in patterns and color, as you can see here, warp face strap or tabby, and so on and so forth. But with from the beginning of the 10th, going further to the 11th century, we can also notice a standardization of the patterns, which suggests the fact that, particularly in Iceland, this several type of cloths, the so-called vaðmál, had become a tool for trade, so replacing silver, for example, which was in small quantities. So we have this twill pattern, and this was used as a replacement for silver. The power of women by performing this act, which eventually also turns lucrative, so they actually earned money by doing it, is also suggested by the mythological aura of spinning and weaving in poetic and saga sources. And before I delve a little bit into the figures known as the Norns, the fates in Norse mythology, I would also like to add something with regard to the tools, not only used for weaving, but also for spinning. The fact that we are dealing with highly ritualized activities indicates a potential magical dimension, a potential connection to the Norse magic known as saga, meaning not magic as you would normally think of it, but with links to shamanism, alteration of consciousness, access to secret knowledge, initiation processes, and so on. So it has very much to do with this idea that you are making something from a raw material and you are turning it into something very organized and structured, with a very high cultural and social relevance. There is also a reference in Ibn Fadlan's account of the Volga Scandinavians, where he points out that there is this kind of door they're raising during a sacrificial act, which may or may not be a connection to the warp-weighted loom as well. Researcher Gardella, for example, linked it to the meaning of the loom as a door to another dimension. This has also to do with the fact that usually in these weaving huts, you can find the loom on the opposite side of the physical door. And on the other hand, you have all kinds of objects, distaffs used in spinning, resembling wands, and these staffs were also found in what seemed to be the burial graves of seeresses of the so-called Volva. Perhaps the most famous case in Norse mythology in relationship to weaving is that of the Norns, the Fates. There is a lot in popular culture about the strong association between these characters and weaving, although I must say that the connection is not always that clear, but we do seem to have, from the few sources on this account, a strong association between fate and the feminine. Fate fits well into the act of weaving because fate, as an inescapable act, exists as a pattern, just like the warp before the weaving begins. And in Old Norse tradition, fate is represented as a process of coming into being at the confluence between that which is set for you and what you can do to navigate around your given pattern, rather than simply an intervention, a divine intervention directing you towards the expected outcome. So we have these three characters, the Nornir, Urd, Verdandi, and Skuld, with a little bit of controversy surrounding them. The three names themselves seem to be a little hard to retrieve. The notion of a triple division of the collective group of Nornin is supported by poems such as Fofnismol in the collection of Nordic mythology known as the poetic Edda, and it resembles all kinds of trinities from the Greek and Roman world, so we should not exclude an influence from this area. The temporal interpretation is also a little bit problematic because they're usually regarded as the past, present, and future. However, Urd and Skuld, they don't really seem to be representatives of specific chronological periods, but rather of aspects of of death and fate. Urd is also linked to the well at the roots of the world tree. Yggdrasil, and Skuld is also found in lists of Valkyriur, so of battle deities, the deities choosing the dead from the battlefield. So there are no clear-cut representations of the Nornir engaged in spinning and weaving. The Eddic poem Volundarkvida, on the other hand, has such a reference, and it is very important to us. It contains maybe the only reference to supernatural female figures who spin, and in the poem we can find the term Örlog Drygja, which means to fulfill fate. The term Nornir, however, is nowhere mentioned in the entire poem, and neither is it in the prose passages accompanying it. The prose introduction labels these women as Valkyriur, in fact, but the poem simply calls them maidens, Meyjar. In scholarship, the women are also referred to as the swan maidens, a term which doesn't really occur that often in Old Norse tradition. And the set of names applied to them, Hervor, Hlaðgudr, and Olrun, hint at the fact that they have this battle connotation as well. Hervor, for example, is compounded from the noun her, which means army, and Vor, who is listed as the goddess of oaths in one of the Thulur, the lists of gods. And with regard to the other names as well, we have reference to either a killing battle goddess in the case of Hlaðgudr, and Olrun, probably some kind of reference to ale runes also mentioned in poems, such as the one where the Valkyria Brynhildr from the cycle of the Volsungs gives knowledge to the hero Sigurdr. Well, in this poem, these female figures are liminal. They are between water and land, between night and day, between human and animal. They don't easily fit into a particular category. And fate in this poem seems not to be something imposed on the three brothers marrying these women, but rather to be a fate to which the women themselves are subject, namely that they must act like migrating birds in consequence. And then we have the poem Helgakvida Hundingspana, also from the collection Poetic Edda, an evidence for the Nornir, this time by name involved in some kind of textile related activity. They are acting as creators of fate at the birth of a hero. And here you can find the term Örlogþato, which means fate threads. So this clearly conveys a close link between fate and threads. On the other hand, we have terms such as snúa, which is to twist, greiða, which is to comb out, implying the fact that we might have to do with, we might be dealing with something else than spinning. Applying, for example, was something proposed by the researcher Beck Peterson, because on a spindle, plying can be done by fastening the ends of the strands onto the spindle, and while carefully keeping the individual strands separate, you can twist them together by turning the spindle in the opposite direction. So basically you have three strands coming together in one thread, representing one fate or something like that. So they are twisted into one end of each thread, fastened into the sky, and where the threads split apart, they're fastened in three. And very interesting is the fact that the reference is to a geographical binding, in the sense that the prince should have the land between these threads. So it's not only related to fate, but also to a geographical demarcation. So with this in mind, I am going to now describe a little bit the poem I've been focusing on, this compelling source. It's a piece from the saga of Njol, and it is a description of a supernatural weaving. You have a very frightening imagery where you catch a glimpse of the strong relationship between women, war, and weaving, and its magical connotations. So in addition to choosing warriors for Valhall in this particular poem, the Valkyries play an active part in the outcome of the Battle of Clontarf in 1014, where the Irish king Brian Boru won the battle, but he died. So we're basically dealing with soldiers, noticing early in the morning some women, 12 or 6 in the poem, riding and entering a hut. follows them, and then he peers through the window and realizes that the women are engaged in a weaving process with a warp-weighted loom, but using human organs as pieces of the loom. And this can be considered as being an enhancement of the narrative, but also a disruption. There is also a bit of controversy regarding the actual battle taking place, with some researchers considering that the battle depicted here was not actually the Battle of Clontarf because of some incongruences in the subject matter. For example, the fact that the battle was not won by the Norse, and the poem, on the other hand, deals with this Norse prince actually winning the battle. So because of this, it might have been a later addition to the text. So what are we dealing with here? Well, from the first two stanzas, you can see that these women associated with battle, they are setting up a loom. And the threads are open for the dead. It's raining blood from the crossbeam, and a grey weave is forming, which the friends of Randverskiller, this is a common metaphor or kenning for Valkyrjur, fills with the red weft. And then the warp is woven with men's entrails, heavily weighted with men's heads, blood-covered spears, and the heddle rods. The shed is ironclad, shaken by arrows. And at the end of the stanza, they say that they will strike with swords, this weave of victory. The terminology here is very important because it is perhaps the most complex list of terms used for different objects linked to weaving. So you have the terms, for example, for weft and warp, for pin beater, sword beater, and so on and so forth. These women, they are singing while working and prophesize doom on the battlefield. They're turning the poem into an example of fate actualization. The material practice can be found very well into these two stanzas, but they're also continuing in the next one. They are basically beating the sigurvef, the so-called battle web, with swords. There have been several theories about this poem. There are people who consider that this is just a poetic image, but no fate is involved. And on the other hand, the very strong links between these activities and what is actually happening on the battlefield and in the description after this poem suggests that we are more likely dealing with a case of sympathetic magic, which means that Valkyrjur, both weaving and on the battlefield, they actually influence the fate of the warriors, and the supernatural cannot really be dissociated from the activity. The correspondence of archetypal activities, so weaving in the household on the one hand, and choosing the slain on the other hand for the supernatural women, we can consider it as an allusion to women as guardians of life and death. And to my mind as well, we are dealing with the vision and happening noticed by someone who is required to play an active role. At the end, we have this person actually looking at what is happening, and then we have an involvement of the audience at the end of the poem. So since weaving is such a highly skilled and meticulous activity requiring a great deal of organizational skills, among other things, foresight, creation, and so on, this can be linked to the idea of manipulating the outcome of a battle. And as a common thread, we again have this idea of fate. And this is, as a piece of evidence for this, we have several places in the poem. For example, Lotum eigi líf hans farask, let us not allow his life to be lost. So this clearly shows a direct involvement into what is going on. Or nu fyrir odum jarmaður hnigin, now the earl has fallen before the spears. Again, there is a direct connection to what is going on the battlefield. A clear-cut reference to mythical weavers, but Valkyrjur names, and nowhere in skaldic poetry do Valkyrjur appear with reference in relationship to weaving. But then again, in Norse mythology, we should refrain from drawing boundaries between these mythological categories. And Yeah, and besides, we also have a very clear order of how these activities are performed, and this also suggests the fact that these women are actually engaged in structuring life and death. And on the other hand, we have a potential symbiotic relationship between the weapons used in these activities. For example, the dor, the spear used as the heather rod, the arrow, the or as pin beater, and so on and so forth. What I wanted to point out are some connections with other references, both in Old English literature and in Old Norse literature, which might help us see this relationship a little bit better. For example, we have in the Exeter riddle book, we have a riddle 56, saying something about somebody being inside when he saw a piece of wood moving to and fro, wounding a struggling creature. It received battle wounds, deep gashes, darts caused it woe, as did the wood skillfully bound fast. And the riddle goes on into the direction of the weave, again, the warp-weighted loom being represented, and again, this connection with violent imagery. Beowulf also has some references to the web of fate, Wikspeda, for example, or it also has a reference to the peace weaver, in connection to a queen who does not live up to her role in society. And in the poem, the rhyming poem, you also have a reference to a fate being given to you. And from Old Norse literature, to come a bit back to that, I mentioned before the Helga Kvidda Hundingspanna, where we have an example of Nornir spinning, probably, or plying, but at any case, we have this idea of fate threads, the Orlokþoto, and you also have some references in the sagas. I found, for example, perhaps the most compelling one in Laxdœla saga, where you have a woman called Gudrun who is spinning, and at the same time her husband kills Kjartan, who is actually the one who she loves, but because she cannot have him, she decides to have him killed. And you also have two more examples in the Fossbredar saga and in the Ørbygja saga, with two elder women, this time Grima and Katla, performing acts of disappearance by matching while weaving or spinning. However, this doesn't really seem to be the case of relationship with fate. This rather has to do with some spell, some trick. The case in Laxdœla saga, I would say it is more compelling in this case. And then you have Jomsvikinga saga, where you have Ingibjorg, who has a dream similar to the poem I mentioned before, a premonition regarding the death of King Harald. So you can see in a quote from the Laxdœla saga, for example, Misjofn verða morginverkin ek hevi spunnit 12 olna garn en tu hevir vegit Kjartan. So she basically says that she spun 12 elves of wool, and in the meantime, in the morning, you had nothing better to do than to kill Kjartan. Curiously, this would be also the price somebody would have to have paid as a ransom for killing someone, according to law codes such as the Grógós in Iceland. So there is definitely a connection here to this fatalistic function. So in conclusion, I would say that from what I have read so far, I don't think that textiles only have the significance of domestic activity. On the contrary, in Daradaryod, for example, you have this unique preservation of technical vocabulary, metonymic association between weaving and weapons, accurate representations of the physical and material process of weaving, combined with the idea that fate can be constructed using material processes, suggesting that the poem is a significant moment in the saga as a whole. And afterwards, after this poem, the hero Kori actually manages to avenge the killing of the family of Njol. So it does have some implications beyond the simple metaphoric relationship between the text and the textile. And this is a connection that I think it is worth exploring a little further, the link between text and textile, between weaving and writing. You have in Latin a word for this, the textere, for both activities. And while this may sound like a modern approach to intertextuality, the cultural connection between poetry and material objects is not necessarily anachronistic, because textile work can be thought of as a performative act mirroring text and contributing to cultural meanings assigned in a story. It is basically a speech act translated materially, with a witness to carry on the message, and with a clear intention from the part of the spear women, of the Valkyries. So in this poem, as well as in the other sources I mentioned, we can regard weaving as an act of ordering and shaping reality by means of arguments such as, first of all, the vital importance of this economic activity, and then the use of specific terminology in particularly this poem, the Daradaryod, but also in other poems as well. The link between weaving and battle suggested by the symbiotic relationship between tools in weaving and tools in battle, and then the idea of materializing fate through this process of either spinning, weaving, either way, a textile process. All right, I hope I did not talk too much. And thank you very much for listening to what I had to say. I'm looking forward to presenting this in the form of an article as well in the future.